Before we begin, if you enjoy falling asleep to quiet history, I'd love your support. Let's see if we can reach 100 likes on this video. It may seem small, but each like helps more people discover these calming stories. And if you'd like to join us each night, you can also subscribe and be part of this journey through forgotten history. Asterisk, the Nile was not simply a river. For those living in ancient Egypt, it was the very pulse of existence. When you imagine the long stretches of desert stretching endlessly east and west, you see at once why the Nile mattered. It was a thin, green lifeline cutting through a land otherwise parched and lifeless. Each year, its waters rose and fell in a cycle so steady and so essential that the entire civilization of the Pharaohs was built upon its rhythm. The flood, inundation as we call it now, arrived with a sense of inevitability around midsummer. When the sun scorched the land and the sky seemed cloudless for months on end, word would drift northward that the river far to the south in Nubia had begun to swell. Rains had fallen on the Ethiopian highlands, though Egyptians themselves might never see those distant downpours. What they experienced instead was the slow, steady rising of their river diet. At first, the water slapped at the edges of the riverbanks, covering the reeds and pushing into the fields. Then, over days and weeks, the flow deepened and widened, filling irrigation channels, submerging plots of land, and sometimes cutting off pathways. Families who lived close to the river would retreat to slightly higher ground, carrying baskets, tools, and animals, knowing that for a time the river would swallow their fields. It was a period of waiting, of watching the water rise, and of trusting in the ancient pattern that once it receded, fertile soil would remain. The Egyptians had a word for this cycle, akit, the season of inundation. To them, it was the beginning of a year, a reminder that life began anew, not with planting or with harvest, but with the river itself. Priests observed the river carefully, measuring its height with simple but precise tools called nilometers, stone stairways cut into riverbanks, where markings could reveal the depth. A high flood promised abundance. A low flood spelled hunger. Too much water could destroy, too little could doom. In quiet villages, Ates did not speak of distant gods in the abstract. They saw the flood as the work of Hapi, the Nile god, often pictured as a plump figure with water lilies in overflowing vessels. For them, piety was practical. Offerings might be placed at shrines. Prayers whispered as the waters crept closer, a plea that this year would bring balance. For the majority of Egypt's population ordinary, farmers, their survival rested entirely on whether the flood behaved as expected. The process was both monotonous and monumental. Families tied their goats to stone posts so they would not be swept away. Clay jars were filled with water in case the wells became contaminated. Small boats were pulled up to the higher ground, ready to ferry supplies if paths were cut off. And children, restless and excited, would splash in the rising pools, unafraid. For they knew no other life. Once the river had spread itself across the land, people waited. They did not plow. They did not sow. The fields, covered in muddy water, belonged to the river. Days passed in quiet patience. For many, it was a rare pause in the agricultural calendar. Work still existed, driving tools, mending nets, weaving baskets, but the labor of the fields fell silent. Perhaps, in those slow weeks, families told stories, recited proverbs, or simply watched the water drift past, carrying bits of reed, wood, and the occasional lost animal carcass. When the waters finally began to sink back into the riverbed, they left behind something priceless, a layer of rich, dark silt. It was this thin blanket of fertile soil that turned desert into farmland. Without it, Egypt would have been barren. With it, Egypt became a breadbasket, producing more grain than almost any other region of the ancient world. The fields, once waterlogged, now bore the signs of readiness. Farmers guided oxen to drag plows through the softened earth. Women scattered seeds of barley and emmer wheat by hand, step after step, their baskets swinging rhythmically as they walked the length of each plot. Children sometimes followed behind, pressing seeds lightly into the soil with their bare feet. It was not glamorous, but it was essential, the foundation of meals, wages, taxes, and offerings to temples. And yet, beneath this routine, there was always a sense of unease. What if the waters had been too high? Floods that covered homes or washed away boundary markers could spark disputes that dragged on for years. What if the waters had been too low? Then the silt would be thin, the crops weak, and the temples empty of offerings. Grain silos would not fill, and families would tighten their belts. The Pharaoh himself was often judged by this balance. Though he could not control the rains of Ethiopia, he was expected to embody Ma'at, the principle of order and harmony. Floods failed repeatedly. Whispers spread. Had the king failed in his sacred duty? Was the balance of the world shifting? It was not only the peasants who depended on the river. The entire state machinery, scribes, priests, officials, stood on grain grown in the aftermath of the flood. For modern eyes, it may seem monotonous, this endless cycle of water rising, spreading, retreating, and leaving behind mud. But to those who lived through it, this monotony was security. It was the one constant in a world where sandstorms could bury fields, where locusts might descend, where disease could sweep a village. The flood was expected, counted upon, and woven into the fabric of life. And yet, history tells us that the Nile was not always predictable. In some years, its waters barely rose. In others, they surged violently, sweeping away fields and homes. The rhythm of survival could turn uncertain, and when it did, everything from the poorest hut to the palace of the pharaoh felt the strain. One might wonder, in a civilization so dependent on a single river, what happened in the years when the Nile refused to behave as expected? The Nile's gift was life, but its uncertainty could just as easily bring despair. To understand how Egyptians lived through this fragile balance, you must imagine the entire kingdom, from the grand temples of Thebes to the humblest mud brick huts along the delta, waiting for the same thing, the water. When the inundation came as expected, order was preserved. The priests, whose task it was to interpret divine will, declared the season favorable. The pharaoh's image was paraded through temples, and hymns were sung to Hapi, thanking him for the swelling of the river. Farmers went about their duties, confident that their crops would grow. Granaries filled, bread was baked, and beer was brewed. But when the flood strayed from its usual measure, unease spread through every layer of society. Egyptians had no illusions about their dependence. The inscriptions left on temple walls and in administrative papyri often record not only the glories of kings, but also the measure of the Nile. For centuries, scribes climbed the Nilometers, carved steps descending into the river to note the precise height of the water. These records were not idle. They determined the scale of taxation, the rationing of grain, and even the stability of government. A high flood meant rich harvests, but it also meant more taxes. The state claimed its portion, not only to feed officials and priests, but also to stockpile reserves in great silos for lean years. And those lean years did come when the river faltered, when its rise was shallow. The scribes' records carried grim tidings. The harvest would be weak, and famine would follow. Famine in ancient Egypt was not simply an empty stomach. It was a collapse of order. Fields lay barren, livestock weakened, and trade faltered. People might abandon their villages to search for food, leaving behind silent homes. Temples lacked offerings, which meant priests declared the gods angry. And always, the blame circled back to the pharaoh. Was he truly the chosen of the gods? If so, why had the river failed? In such times, rebellions stirred and dynasties cracked. Asterisk yet, for all the anxiety, Egyptians did not respond passively. They developed systems of irrigation to manage the waters more carefully. Canals were dug, dikes built, basins shaped to hold water for longer. These projects were enormous, requiring thousands of laborers. Ordinary men were called to leave their villages during the season when fields lay underwater to dig, haul, and shape mud under the sun. To them, it was both duty and burden. The state demanded their work, promising that the canals would bring water when the river failed. But for many, it was simply another form of tax, paid not in grain but in sweat. Still, the system endured. With each cycle, Egyptians improved their control over the flood. They did not tame the Nile, no one could, but they learned to guide it. Basins collected the floodwater, releasing it slowly into fields. Canals carried its flow to distant plots. Reservoirs held back some portion for drier months. In this way, survival depended not only on the river itself, but on the invisible web of human effort that managed. Even with these systems, famine could never be fully prevented. Ancient texts speak quietly of hunger. Straka, those broken pottery shards used for everyday writing, sometimes carried notes of grain rations or complaints of shortages. More hauntingly, there are inscriptions that describe years of famine so severe that families bartered their belongings for a handful of barley. The state might release reserves from royal granaries, but even those could run dry. And in such years, people's faith in the cosmic order in Manat was tested. It is striking to consider how deeply the Nile's flood was woven into Egyptian thought. Their calendar itself was divided into 3 seasons: Akit, inundation; Pare, emergence, the growing season; and Shemu, harvest. Time itself revolved around the water's movement. Even their myths carried echoes of the river. The god Osiris, associated with fertility and rebirth, was linked in spirit to the silt that renewed the land each year. Just as Osiris was dismembered and restored, so too the land was drowned and reborn. On a practical level, farmers adapted their daily lives to this rhythm. During Akati, they repaired their homes, cared for animals, and performed corvée labor on state projects. During Pare, they sowed and tended crops, their days measured by the sun's path and the growth of green shoots rising from the black soil. During Shemu, they harvested, storing grain in clay jars, threshing it with animals, and carrying the surplus to granaries where scribes weighed and counted it. Then the cycle began again, year after year, century after century. What makes this rhythm remarkable is its longevity. For nearly 3,000 years, Egyptian life followed the pulse of the Nile. Empires rose and fell around them, but the peasants of Egypt bent over the same fields, sowed the same grains, and trusted the same river. Even when foreign rulers came, Libyans, Nubians, Persians, Greeks, the river did not change. It still rose, spread, and fell, indifferent to politics. To live in Egypt was to submit to that unchanging cycle. And yet, history tells us of moments when the river broke this pattern. The Middle Kingdom collapsed, in part because of repeated low floods that caused famine and unrest. Centuries later, in the New Kingdom, inscriptions speak of years when hunger stalked the land. Even in the Ptolemaic era, when Greek kings ruled Egypt, the Nile's level remained the measure of all prosperity. It is difficult, from the modern perspective, to grasp how complete this dependence was. Today, food comes from countless places. Trade and technology buffer us from single failures. But in ancient Egypt, life was narrower. Every loaf of bread, every jug of beer, every meal of lentils or onions began with the Nile's silt. There was no alternative. Consider the mind of an ordinary peasant. He rose before dawn, stepped into the cool air, and walked to his flooded fields. He could not see Ethiopia, where the rains determined his fate. He could not know the science of rainfall. or river systems. What he knew was simple. If the water rose high enough, his family would eat. If not, hunger would gnaw. His prayers, his offerings, his labor all were directed toward securing this single, fragile necessity. And so, as the Nile rose each summer, people watched anxiously. Each ripple of the water was more than a natural event. It was a signal from the gods, a message about the year to come. Would it be abundance? Would it be scarcity? Would the Pharaoh be celebrated as upholding order, or whispered about as one who had lost divine favor? The Nile gave, and the Nile withheld. That was the truth known to every Egyptian, whether king or a peasant. And the question always lingered. In the background, what would happen when the balance tilted too far, when the flood no longer followed its ancient rhythm? To complete the picture of the Nile's flood, you must imagine not only the fields and farmers, but also the machinery of the state that hovered above them. For the inundation was never just a natural event, was the foundation of politics, religion, and power in Egypt. The rhythm of the flood reached into temples, palaces, and courts, shaping decisions that echoed far beyond the banks of the river. The Pharaoh, the divine ruler, stood at the center of this system. Though he had no control over the rains in Ethiopia or the swelling of the river, he was held responsible for them nonetheless. His very legitimacy rested on maintaining my cosmic order. When the Nile rose properly, his rule was affirmed. When it failed, his authority could be questioned. This link between river and throne meant that each inundation became a kind of judgment on the state itself to guard against disaster. The bureaucracy of Egypt developed meticulous systems for managing grain. Granaries, vast mud brick structures with small windows and sealed doors, were built to store the harvest. Inside, scribes recorded every measure of barley and emmer, carefully tallying what was owed in taxes and what would be kept for future use. These granaries were more than storage. They were insurance against famine and also instruments of control. Whoever commanded the grain commanded loyalty. Taxes, too, were bound to the Nile's rhythm. After the floodwaters receded and the crops began to grow, officials would visit villages to assess fields. Using ropes and measuring rods, they calculated how much land had been sown. From these measures, they determined the grain tax owed. This was not a choice. Farmers who failed to pay could have their cattle seized, their tools taken, or their land confiscated. The system ensured that the state's coffers and silos filled, even if the people themselves tightened their belts at the same time. Temples across Egypt grew fat with offerings tied to the flood. Each harvest, portions of grain, beer, and livestock were dedicated to the gods. These offerings kept priests fed and temples wealthy. In times of scarcity, temples sometimes became places of refuge, their reserves sustaining the desperate. Yet even this generosity reinforced hierarchy. Survival was mediated by the gods, and the gods spoke through the priests. Still, the Nile's flood was not only about politics and survival, it shaped culture itself. Festivals marked the inundation's arrival, celebrating Hapi, the god of the flood, who was imagined as a nurturing, androgynous figure with water plants and overflowing jars. Hymns to Hapi, carved in stone and preserved on papyri, reveal how deeply Egyptians revered the river's cycle. These hymns spoke of life renewed, of lands reborn, of plenty restored after the river's waters had passed. Beyond hymns and festivals, the Nile's rhythm entered Egyptian art and literature. Wall paintings in tombs often depict green fields, lotus flowers, and fish swimming in blue waters. These were not decorative alone. They were prayers for abundance in the afterlife, images of the river's gifts, eternalized for eternity. 2. The Egyptian imagination. The Nile was not just a place on earth, it was a mirror of the divine. Daily life, too, carried the imprint of the flood. A peasant family might mark their year by its stages. the anxious waiting of Akit, the busy sowing of Pare, the exhausting harvest of Shemu. Children learned early the signs of the water's rise. Fishermen timed their nets to the swelling river, catching fish driven into shallows. Potters and brickmakers shaped clay dug fresh from silted banks. Even herdsmen guided their cattle along new pastures revealed when the water retreated. Every craft and trade, in some way, drew life from the river's pattern, and yet, always, there was fragility. Modern science tells us that volcanic eruptions in distant lands, altering rainfall in Ethiopia, could disrupt the Nile's flow. Droughts lasting several years could devastate Egypt. Historical records confirm this. Inscriptions tell of years when hunger spread so widely that villages emptied and temples fell silent. It was not an everyday occurrence, but it was always a possibility. This awareness gave the Nile a double character. It was both gift and threat, security and risk. It is worth pausing to reflect on how monotonous and yet how profound this cycle must have felt for centuries. Egyptian life changed little. A farmer's tools, plow, sickle, basket remained, almost identical from one dynasty to the next. The sowing of barley, the baking of bread, the brewing of beer were repeated endlessly, as predictable as the river's rise. And yet, this monotony was what sustained one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history. In the end, the Nile's inundation was more than a natural event. It was the quiet engine of Egyptian civilization, the pulse that kept it alive for millennia. And though the river sometimes failed, though hunger sometimes came, the people endured. Their patience, their labor, and their faith in the rhythm of water and silt carried them through. As you listen to this story, you might find yourself wondering, what does it mean for a civilization to depend so completely on one fragile rhythm? And what lessons might our own age, with all its complexities, draw from the steady, monotonous, decayed, and essential flood of the Nile? Asterisk. When we think of Egypt, we picture pyramids, temples, and statues carved in stone. Yet the true heart of the civilization, the quiet machinery that sustained it for millennia, was not built of granite or gold. It was built of mud brick, packed with straw, shaped into massive structures that rarely survived the centuries. These were the grain silo silent towers of storage that fed the people, the priests, and the pharaohs. A silo was not beautiful in the way a temple was, nor grand in the way of a palace. It was functional, even dull to the eye. A mud brick wall, rounded or rectangular, sometimes rising 2 or 3 stories high, with narrow openings to pour grain in and small hatches near the base to let it out. Yet, without them, Egypt's glory would have been impossible. For in these dim, airless chambers rested the true wealth of the Nile, the harvest to imagine, for a moment, the process. The Nile had risen, the fields had been sown, the crops grown tall and golden under the relentless sun. At harvest, families moved together in long lines, men and women cutting the stalks with bronze sickles. Children carried bundles to threshing floors where cattle trampled the stalks, separating grain from straw. King came winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so the wind carried away chaff. What was left, small kernels of barley or emmer wheat, was precious, far more valuable than gold. These kernels were not consumed immediately. They were measured, portioned, and stored. And here the silos became essential. Without storage, grain spoiled, rotted, or was eaten by pests. Without storage, there could be no taxes, no wages, no temples filled with offerings. Grain was currency, food, and security. So, it was gathered into baskets, carried up ramps, and poured into the dark mouths of the silos, vanishing into a hidden reserve that would last months, even years. The state's hand was present in every step. Scribes, standing with wooden pallets and reed pens, recorded how much grain entered each silo. Their records, written on papyri or carved onto astraca were bureaucratic and exact. So many sacks from this village, so many from that estate. To the Egyptians, order began with counting, and the counting of grain was perhaps the most important act of all. For the silos fed not just the people, but the entire machinery of Egypt. Workers who built temples or pyramids were often paid in grain rations, loaves of bread, jars of beer, both made from the harvest. Priests who maintained shrines received portions of stored grain as their due. Even soldiers on campaign relied on the grain reserves that the state distributed. Each kernel in the silo was a unit of power, sustaining lives and sustaining loyalty. What is striking is how these structures, though monotonous and plain, carried so much weight in the imagination of Egyptians. In tomb paintings, depictions of grain silos appear alongside scenes of farming, as if to remind the deceased that abundance required careful keeping. In administrative papyri, lists of grain deliveries stretch 4 pages, each figure an anchor of survival. And in myths, the fertility of the land was tied to the abundance of grain, which itself was safeguarded in silos. Yet, grain silos were also symbols of inequality. The majority of Egyptians were farmers who labored in the sun, growing crops from the silt. Their grain did not remain in their homes. A portion was taken as tax, hauled away to state or temple silos. In times of plenty, this was accepted, even welcomed. In times of scarcity, resentment grew. The silos loomed not just as symbols of security, but as reminders that the state's granaries could be full even as villagers went hungry. Archaeology has given us glimpses of these silos in places like Amarna, the short-lived capital of Akhenaten. Whole fields of circular silos have been uncovered, arranged in neat rows. Each was perhaps 5 or 6 meters across, built of thick mud brick, now crumbled but once imposing. Other silos were connected to administrative complexes, evidence that grain storage was closely tied to the work of officials. In Deir el-Medina, the village of the royal tomb builders, small silos stood near houses, holding rations for specialized workers who lived apart from the farms. The scale could be staggering. In some temples, storage magazines lined entire courtyards, hundreds of meters of long, narrow chambers where grain and other goods were kept. The great temple of Karnak, for instance, was not only a religious center, but also an economic one, with silos and storerooms that ensured priests and laborers were sustained. In this way, religion, state, and economy were inseparable. To worship was also to manage resources for the ordinary villager, though the experience of the silo was practical. After harvest, carts creaked under the weight of sacks. Oxen strained as they hauled the grain toward collection points. Officials with measuring rods stood ready, calculating the owed portion. The grain was then funneled into silos, sealed away. Families returned home with what remained, hoping it would last the year. For them, the silo was both salvation and burden, storehouse for survival, and a reminder of what was taken. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Egyptian silos is not their architecture, but their endurance as an idea. For thousands of years, across dynasties, the system barely changed. Mud brick walls, narrow openings, dark interiors, it was simple, reliable, and endlessly repeated. Even when Greek and Roman rulers came, they adopted the same principles. The logic was universal. Control of grain meant control of people. If you look closely, you can see how the silos shaped Egypt's stability, cushioned the impact of Connery. Poor floods by holding reserves from earlier years. They allowed great building projects by feeding workers who might otherwise have been tied to their own fields. They ensured armies could march without starving. They gave priests offerings to present to gods. The silos were invisible monuments, their walls plain, their contents hidden. but their influence stretched across every corner of life. And so, as the Nile rose and fell each year, as fields bloomed and harvests were gathered, the silent silos waited. They filled and emptied, their cycles mirroring the river itself. Mud brick and straw, grain and dust, these were the materials of empire. One might wonder, what did it mean for a civilization to place its faith not only in gods and kings, but also in silent towers of mud and grain? The grain silos of ancient Egypt were more than simple storage spaces. They represented an entire system of survival, administration, and power that stretched from the smallest villages to the court of the pharaoh himself. To follow their story is to walk through the quiet corridors of Egypt's bureaucracy, where scribes bent over reed pens and officials measured every sack of grain as though it was sacred. Consider first the act of measuring. Grain, unlike gold or jewels, could not be weighed in small scales alone. Instead, it was poured into standard containers, mahith, or hecate volumes that officials recognized across the land. Scribes, standing at silo entrances, tallied each load on papyrus rolls. Their writing might seem tedious, little more than endless rows of numbers, but it was the lifeblood of Egypt. Without accurate records, no one could know how much the state possessed, how much could be distributed, and how much was owed in tax. These records were precise. Surviving fragments tell us of harvest accounts. So many sacks from the fields of the house of Ammon, so many from the estate of the queen, so many from the land of the peasant Ani. Each entry anchored grain to a source, binding individuals, temples, and estates into the greater network of the state. To modern readers, it may appear boring, a monotony of counting and measuring. Yet, behind those numbers lay full granaries, full stomachs, and the possibility of survival. Silos were not only for storage, but also for redistribution. Once sealed, they became centers of economic exchange. Workers building royal tombs at Deir El Medina, for example, did not receive coin. Their wages were paid in grain ration standard measures that sustained their households. Bakers and brewers turned the grain into bread and beer, the daily diet of the Egyptian people. Soldiers, too, marched with grain on their backs, baked into loaves that fed them on campaigns in Nubia or the Levant. Temples held their own networks of silos, storing offerings dedicated to the gods. These offerings, however, rarely stayed in the sanctuaries. Instead, they were redistributed among the priesthood and temple workers. In this way, grain sustained not only the spiritual, but also the very practical functioning of religious institutions. Priest who shaved his head daily and chanted hymns in the temple did so, knowing his ration of bread and beer came from those same silos. The state also relied on reserves to smooth out the Nile's unpredictability. When floods failed, when crops were thin, granaries became lifelines. Officials might open sealed silos to distribute emergency rations. Relief was not always equal. Favored temples, key workers, or certain estates might receive more than common villagers. Still, presence of reserves allowed Egypt to survive famines that would have devastated less organized societies. But these same silos could also be instruments of power. Whoever controlled the granaries controlled the people. In inscriptions, kings boasted not only of their temples and victories, but also of their ability to fill granaries. A pharaoh's legitimacy was tied to his role as provider, as one who ensured the Nile's bounty was properly stored and shared. To open the silos, in famine was a sign of generosity. To keep them sealed was tyranny. The technology of silos was simple but ingenious. Built of thick mud brick, their walls kept out heat and pests. Openings were placed high, so grain could be poured in from above. Smaller hatches near the base allowed controlled release, preventing waste. Floors were raised or layered with plaster to protect against damp. In large complexes, dozens of silos might stand side by side, forming a field of rounded domes. To walk among them was to see Egypt's true wealth, not in gold or statues, but in humble mud structures filled with barley. Even ordinary households sometimes built smaller silos beside their homes, particularly in wealthier villages. These personal silos ensured a family's grain would last until the next harvest. But the majority of storage remained in the hands of temples and the state. This centralization meant security, but it also meant dependence. A farmer might grow the grain, but once it entered the silo, it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Egypt, to the gods, and to the bureaucracy that guarded it. Archaeological discoveries bring these silos vividly to life. At the workers' village of Kahun, silos were found clustered near houses, evidence of local storage. At Amarna, Akhenaten's capital, entire courts of silos were uncovered, their mud brick walls still rising above the desert floor. At Thebes, within temple precincts, long rows of magazines hint at the scale of storage needed from massive institutions. Each find reveals the same pattern. Grain was gathered, counted, sealed, and guarded. One can imagine the routine. After harvest, lines of donkeys carried sacks to collection points. Men heaved baskets up ramps, pouring grain into the mouths of silos. Dust filled the air. Scribes, seated nearby, scratched marks on papyri as each load disappeared inside. Once, full workers plastered the silos' openings shut. Silence returned. Inside, the grain lay in darkness, waiting for the months when it would be needed. And in that silence rested the fate of Egypt. A good harvest meant full silos, easy taxation, content workers. A poor harvest meant disputes, hunger, and unrest. There are records from certain dynasties of revolts sparked not by wars or succession crises, but by grain shortages. When silos were empty, the entire system of Egypt trembled. To look at these structures today, crumpled and eroded, is to see little of their former importance. They are unimpressive ruins, piles of mud brick half buried in sand. Yet, to those who lived then, they were the axis of life. A temple might awe with its columns, but a full silo brought comfort in the stomach. A palace might dazzle with gold, but a sealed silo promised survival. The Egyptians understood this truth well. In tomb paintings of nobles, scenes of harvest and storage are common. To depict silos in the afterlife was to wish for eternal abundance. To ensure that beyond death, one's spirit would never hunger. These images, though plain, carried deep meaning. They reveal a worldview in which wealth was not only display, but also sustenance. And so, year after year, generation after generation, the cycle continued. Grain was harvested, stored, redistributed, consumed, and harvested again. The silos stood silent witnesses to this repetition. They were boring in their constancy, monotonous in their design, and yet utterly indispensable. One cannot help but ask, in a land so rich in monuments of stone, why did the true monuments, the silos of mud, matter even more? To understand the full weight of Egypt's grain silos, one must see them not only as warehouses, but as instruments that defined social order, stability, and even justice. For every kernel stored was a bond between farmer and state, between temple and people, between Pharaoh and the gods. The bureaucracy surrounding these structures was immense. Scribes, those tireless recorders of Egypt's daily life ensured that not a sack of grain went unaccounted for. There read pens scratched endlessly across papyrus, tallying debts, distributions, and reserves. Some documents dry lists of numbers and names. To the modern eye, they appear tedious, but in their neat columns was the fate of families. A missed entry could mean accusations of theft. An undercount could mean famine. The monotony of accounting was, in truth, the quiet scaffolding of survival. Temples, with their sprawling estates, relied heavily on silos, the great sanctuaries of Amen at Karnak or Ptah at Memphis commanded fields and herds whose produce poured into granaries. From there, rations spread outward, feeding priests, singers, craftsmen, and laborers. To enter the temple complex was to step not only into a world of ritual, but also into an economy humming with activity. The daily prayers to gods required bread and beer, made possible only through the silos standing nearby. The state itself wielded silos as levers of loyalty. In times of famine, the opening of granaries was an act of mercy, reinforcing the image of the pharaoh as protector. In contrast, withholding grain could be a tool of discipline, reminding subjects of their dependence. A king's inscriptions might boast of filling silos to overflowing, not merely as an agricultural fact, but as proof of divine favor. To fill a granary was to uphold Ma'at, the balance of the cosmos. Yet silos also revealed inequality, for while temples and palaces brimmed with reserves, villages sometimes went hungry. Records hint at disputes where peasants accused officials of hoarding, or where grain intended for rations was siphoned off for elite households. The granary, in this sense, was both salvation and a symbol of control. It fed Egypt, but it also reminded each farmer that the fruit of his labor no longer belonged to him once it crossed the silo threshold into archaeology. Taints the picture with clarity. In Amarna Akhenaten's radical capital, excavations revealed courtyards lined with silo bases, their circular footprints still visible in the sand. In Deir el-Medina, smaller silos clustered beside workers' homes, a sign of rations distributed. Regularly, two skilled craftsmen at Tel el-Amarna, entire storage complexes, once roofed with beams and mud plaster, suggest how the city's economy relied on centralized reserves. These discoveries confirm what texts already tell us. Silos were everywhere, in villages, cities, temples, and estates. The daily use of these silos was both mundane and ritualized. Farmers brought grain after harvest. Officials measured it with ropes and containers. Scribes recorded it, and workers sealed the openings with clay plaster. The act of sealing was itself symbolic. Once closed, the silo became inviolate, its contents destined for carefully measured release. When the time came to open it, the breaking of the seal was a small ceremony of renewal. As though the stored abundance re-entered the world, the products of the silos reached every Egyptian household, though not equally. For ordinary families, the rations of bread and beer formed the backbone of diet. Loaves, baked in clay ovens, were coarse and heavy, flavored sometimes with herbs or sweetened with dates. Beer, thick and nutritious, was brewed from the same grain, often consumed more than water itself. These foods, humble though they seem, sustained workers building pyramids, soldiers marching to battle, and children playing along the Nile's edge. Behind every meal lay the silent presence of the silo. There is something almost poetic in how such plain structures underpinned Egypt's magnificence. The pyramids could not rise without rations from silos. Temples could not glow with incense and hymns without bread baked from stored grain. Even the elaborate burials of kings required offerings sustained by harvests measured and stored. Without silos, the monuments of stone would have been impossible. Yet fragility lurked within this system. When silos emptied too soon, when pests infested the stores, or when corrupt officials diverted supplies, the entire network faltered. Inscriptions describe famines where people bartered their possessions for grain, or where unrest spread because rations failed. In these moments, the illusion of permanence cracked. The mud brick walls that seemed so solid revealed their limits. Survival could never. When we look back, it is tempting to focus on Egypt's grandeur, the statues, the treasures, the hieroglyphs carved in stone. Yet, beneath it all was the dull rhythm of grain poured into mud brick towers, counted by scribes, sealed by workers, released as rations. This was the quiet truth of Egypt's strength. Its empire was not built on gold, but on barley, not sustained by conquest alone, but by the monotony of storage. In the end, the silos were monuments in their own right, not of beauty, but of endurance, not of glory, but of necessity. They embodied the truth that civilizations are not sustained by marvels, but by the boring, essential details of daily life. And perhaps the question that lingers is this: how often do we overlook the silent structures then, and now that quietly hold our world together? Asterisk, when the pyramids are spoken of, they are often framed as mysteries. Who built them? How? And for what purpose? For centuries, myths spread that slaves, whipped and chained, dragged blocks of stone under the blazing desert sun. But the truth, uncovered slowly through archaeology and fragments of ancient records, is both less dramatic and far more revealing. The pyramids were not built by nameless slaves, but by organized communities of workers, ordinary Egyptians who lived, labored, and died in service to the monuments of their kings. To picture these forgotten builders, begin not at the gleaming peak of a pyramid, but at the dusty edges of the plateau, where long rows of mud brick houses once stood. Excavations at Giza have uncovered these worker villages, simple rectangular dwellings, cramped, their walls plastered with clay. They were not palaces, but they were not prisons either. They were homes for men who came to work in shifts, serving for a season before returning to their villages. The system was called corvée labor, a form of duty owed to the state, and it rotated through Egypt's population. Workers came in teams. They organized themselves into crews with names that have survived, painted in red ink on stone blocks: the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure. Such names reveal something surprising: a sense of camaraderie, even humor, among those who dragged limestone and set blocks. This was not faceless suffering, but a community bound by duty and shared hardship. Their diet tells us even more. Far from starving slaves, these men were fed abundantly. Archaeologists have uncovered bones of cattle, sheep, and goats near the worker settlements. Bread ovens and beer vats stood in rows. The state provided rations of bread, beer, and meat, sustaining laborers whose work demanded enormous energy. By feeding them well, the pharaoh ensured productivity, but also loyalty. Each loaf and jar was drawn, in the end, from the silos we have already described. The work itself was grueling. Blocks of stone, some weighing several tons, were quarried, hauled, and lifted into place with ropes, sledges, and ramps. Teams of men strained together, their bodies bent under the weight, their muscles taut. Overseers shouted commands, ensuring rhythm and unity. Yet, it was not endless chaos. The organization was remarkable. Logs of attendance, ration lists, and graffiti on blocks suggest a system where every man had a role, and each team took pride in its work. Behind the scenes, specialists supported the effort. Stonecutters shaped blocks. Surveyors measured alignments with plumb lines and sighting rods. Carpenters crafted sledges. Bakers produced endless loaves. Brewers filled jars. Cattle were slaughtered daily to feed the workforce. Each worker village was, in effect, a small city humming with activity, its life dedicated to raising the pharaoh's eternal home. For many laborers, this service was not permanent. A farmer might work for a few months during the Nile's inundation, when fields lay underwater and agricultural labor paused. In this way, pyramid building fit neatly into Egypt's rhythm. While the river covered their crops, men carried stones. When the waters receded, they returned home to sow and harvest. Thus, the state harnessed idle time, transforming it into monuments. The dead tell us another story. Excavations near the pyramids uncovered cemeteries of workers. Graves were modest, built of mud brick, but not neglected. Some were buried with jars of beer, bread, or simple amulet signs that they were honored, not discarded. Bones show where spines compressed from heavy lifting, fractures from accidents, arthritis from strain. Yet, some show signs of healing, evidence that injured workers received care before death. This suggests a community where the state recognized its duty, providing not only rations, but also rudimentary medical treatment. And so, the image of the pyramid builder shifts. No longer an anonymous slave, but an ordinary man with a family, drawn into service by duty, fed and housed by the state, laboring in teams that bore names and identities. Their work was hard, repetitive, and often painful, but it was not meaningless. It was bound to the promise of eternity. For the Egyptians, pyramids were not merely tombs. They were symbols of cosmic order, stairways to the heavens, eternal houses for the divine pharaoh. To build them was to participate in something larger than oneself. Even if a laborer's name did not survive, his sweat and effort became part of a structure that would outlast centuries. Perhaps in this there was a kind of pride, and yet behind this pride lurks another truth. For every polished limestone casing, thousands of backs bent beneath rough stone. For every shining peak, calloused hands bled on rope. To me, the glory of the pharaoh rested on the monotony of daily toil. These builders, now forgotten, carried Egypt's dreams in their muscles and bones. Archaeology has restored them to memory. Graffiti scratched onto stone blocks still speak the names of crews, jokes, brief records. Bones unearthed reveal diets, richer than expected, but also lives shortened by labor. Tools found in quarries show the marks of chisels, the grooves of sledges. Piece by piece, we see the builders not as faceless masses, but as men whose lives were consumed by stone and dust. It is easy to admire the pyramids as monuments. Harder, perhaps, to admire the monotony of dragging stone day after day. But it is precisely in this monotony that Egypt's greatness lay. The forgotten builders remind us that history is not made only by kings, but by thousands of ordinary people whose names were lost, though their work endures in every block of stone. And so we are left with a question. If the pyramids stand as eternal monuments to kings, where, in stone or memory, do the builders themselves stand? To continue the story of the pyramid builders, we must move from the quarries and construction ramps into the more hidden layers of their world, the organization, the hierarchy, and the quiet rhythms of daily life that sustained the greatest monuments of the ancient world. Archaeological evidence reveals that the pyramid workforce was divided into rotating teams, often numbering in the tens of thousands, though only a portion labored on-site at any given time. This rotation was deliberate. It allowed Egypt to summon enormous manpower without permanently draining villages of farmers and artisans. Men were called into service seasonally, often during the inundation when agricultural work was impossible. In this way, pyramid labor was woven seamlessly into Egypt's calendar, avoiding total disruption of village life. At the heart of this system were officials and scribes. Overseers ensured discipline, recorded attendance, and managed supplies. Their writings, preserved in fragments, offer small glimpses into daily realities. Notes on workers absent due to illness, lists of rations distributed, tallies of stone deliveries. These are not dramatic inscriptions, but they tell us that pyramid building was not chaos. It was a bureaucracy in motion, each task logged, each loaf of bread accounted for. Hierarchy structured the labor force. At the top stood overseers of works, trusted officials close to the pharaoh. Beneath them were team leaders, directing squads of workers. Skilled artisan stonemasons, carpenters, surveyors formed an elite within the labor community. Their tasks, requiring precision and support systems, surrounded this labor. Bakers produced thousands of loaves daily, using clay ovens to churn out the dense, coarse bread that fueled workers. Brewers made vats of beer, thick and filling, far more nutritious than modern beer. Herds of cattle, sheep, and goats were slaughtered regularly, providing meat an unusual luxury for ordinary Egyptians. Archaeological remains of animal bones near Giza confirmed that the workers' diet was rich compared to villagers who stayed at home. This abundance reflects the state's recognition that hard labor required strong bodies. Medical care also formed part of the system. Skeletal remains of workers show healed fractures and signs of treatment. It seems that when injuries occurred, broken arms, crushed bones, workers were not abandoned. Instead, they received attention and, in some cases, returned to labor after recovery. Care was not generosity alone, but practicality. Trained workers were valuable, and keeping them alive sustained the project. Still, it also hints at a sense of responsibility, a recognition that these men, though expendable in theory, were in practice essential. Women and children likely played supporting roles. Excavations near worker villages suggest the presence of families, perhaps in temporary arrangements. Women may have baked bread, brewed beer, or prepared clothing. Children may have carried water or firewood. The pyramid, then, was not only the work of men pulling stone, but of entire communities whose lives bent around the demands of construction. The monotony of the work must have been immense. Day after day, the same hauling, cutting, shaping, and lifting. Yet, within this monotony lay purpose. For the builders, their labor was tied to something larger than themselves, the eternal house of the pharaoh, a monument that linked heaven and earth. Even if they did not see the divine as intimately as priests, they participated in a sacred project. Their sweat was an offering, their toil a form of service to both king and cosmos. This does not mean all were content. Corvée labor was compulsory. To be called to pyramid duty was to leave one's family, to endure strain, injury, and exhaustion. Some workers surely resented the burden, just as others found pride in their role. And Egypt's system of belief smoothed these tensions. The pharaoh was the mediator of Ma'at, cosmic balance. To serve him was to sustain the order of the world. Complaints may have existed, but they left little trace in official records. What endures instead is the evidence of organization, care, and identity within the labor force. What is most remarkable is how ordinary the builders were. They were not kings or generals, but farmers, herders, and craftsmen. They did not leave behind golden tombs, but simple graves near the pyramids. Their bones tell of arthritis, crushed vertebrae, worn joints, the price of hauling stone. Yet their burials were dignified, provided with bread and beer for the afterlife. In this, we see a quiet recognition. The builders were not forgotten by their own society, even if later ages overlooked them. To walk through the remains of the worker villages today is a step into this forgotten world. The mud brick walls crumble, but their outlines remain. Hearths where bread was baked are still visible. Paths where men walked toward the quarries are etched faintly into the desert. Here, away from the glittering image of the pyramids, lies the true Egypt, one of labor, monotony, and endurance. And so, we must ask, if Egypt's greatness rested on these countless hands, why did history remember only the kings, where, in the official inscriptions, are the voices of the men who hauled the stones. Asterisks, to complete the story of the pyramid builders, we must follow their work, not only in life, but also in the absence of memory. For though their labor created the most enduring monuments of antiquity, their own names, lives, and struggles were quietly erased beneath the weight of stone. The pyramids dominate the horizon still, rising sharp against the desert sky, their sheer bulk a testament to human effort. Yet, when we gaze upon them, we rarely think of the haulers who dragged the blocks, the bakers who filled ovens each dawn, or the carpenters who shaped sledges worn smooth with use. History, written in hieroglyphs on temple walls, reserved its space for kings, gods, and priests. The builders themselves left almost no words of their own. What we know of them comes from fragments graffiti on blocks, bones in the sand, and the dull notes of scribes recording rations. The cemeteries of Giza speak most clearly. Rows of mud brick tombs, small and modest, house the remains of workers. Archaeologists have found skeletons buried with jars of beer, bread loaves, and simple amulets. These burials, though humble, were dignified. They show that workers were not discarded as slaves might be, but honored as men who had fulfilled their duty. Their graves, however, lacked inscriptions that would preserve their names for eternity. In death, as in life, they remained anonymous laborers. The bones themselves whisper of their toil. Many show arthritis, compressed spines, broken limbs. Some fractures healed, others did not. Men lived hard, worked hard, and often died young. Yet they did not die without recognition. Their families placed offerings, ensuring they would eat and drink in the afterlife. In this way, the builders were bound into Egypt's broader vision of eternity. Even if no scribe etched their achievements on stone, the pyramids themselves carry faint traces of the workers' presence on hidden surfaces of blocks, never meant to be seen. Graffiti remains. Read dink marks, noting crew names, jokes, or simple labels. These marks remind us that men once laughed, sweated, and teased one another as they worked. Block might read, "The Friends of Khufu," as though a small team claimed ownership of their contribution. Another might carry a tally of delivery, a sign of the endless rhythm of hauling stone. These are the voices of the forgotten, faint, but enduring. Organization, too, left its mark. The precision of the pyramids, their alignment to cardinal points, their mathematical symmetry was not achieved by pharaohs alone. It was the product of surveyors who sighted stars, masons who cut stone to fit snugly, and crews who obeyed signals with unwavering coordination. Each detail that we marvel at today reflects not mystery, but the accumulated monotony of thousands of repeated actions. What looks like miracle is, in truth, the endurance of labor. Even the infrastructure of pyramid building reveals the scale of their world. Roads built of limestone rubble stretched toward quarries. Canals may have carried stone closer to the site. Ramps rose in long inclines, their surfaces greased with water to reduce friction. Villages housed thousands with bakeries, breweries, and administrative offices. See it all in motion is to imagine a hive, buzzing, repetitive, each worker contributing a small part to a vast and ordered whole. Yet, for all their importance, the builders were invisible in official accounts. Pharaohs carved their own names in stone, proclaimed themselves divine, and filled temples with boasts of eternal glory. Nowhere do we read an inscription saying, "This pyramid was raised by the hands of thousands." The builders lived in the shadows of monuments they would never own, monuments that turned their sweat into symbols of someone else's eternity. Still, their labor shaped Egypt beyond stone. The organization of pyramid building laid foundations for later projects. temples, canals, fortresses. The skills honed in engineering, logistics, medical care, mass feeding became part of Egypt's administrative genius. Though the builders themselves were forgotten, their work taught Egypt how to mobilize, how to organize, how to endure. In this sense, the forgotten builders were Egypt's truest legacy. Their names were not preserved in hieroglyphs, but their labor carried forward in every temple and canal built after. Their contribution was not glory, but continuity. They showed that ordinary men, bound by duty and supported by bread and beer, could raise structures that would outlast empires. Perhaps this is why their story matters now. The pyramids are not only monuments to kings, but also silent memorials to the countless anonymous workers who built them. Each block contains the memory of strained muscles and tired hands. Each ramp once echoed with footsteps and shouts. Builders themselves are gone, their graves unmarked, their words lost, but their work towers above the desert still. And so we are left with a final reflection. The pyramids remind us not only of the ambition of kings, but of the endurance of ordinary people. They show us that history's greatest monuments rest not on brilliance alone, but on monotony, the endless repetition of labor, day after day, year after year. The pharaohs dreamed, but it was the forgotten builders who turned those dreams into stone. And the question lingers when we look at the pyramids today. Do we see only the kings who claimed them, or do we also sense the ghostly presence of the thousands whose lives were consumed in their making? When we think of ancient Egypt, it is easy to picture stone pyramids, temples, colossal statues. Yet beneath the monuments, Egypt's true legacy flowed not in stone, but in reeds. Along the marshy banks of the Nile grew a plant called papyrus, tall and slender, its green stalks rising several meters high, topped with crowns of feathery tufts. To Egyptians, it was more than a plant. It was the material on which memory itself was written, the medium that carried voices across centuries. Without papyrus, Egypt's bureaucracy, literature, in very sense of continuity, might never have endured. The plant itself was ordinary in appearance, common along the river's edge. Its triangular stems could be cut, peeled, and shaped for many uses. Children may have played with its hollow stalks, weaving small boats or mats. Fishermen used papyrus bundles as lightweight rafts, pushing silently across still waters. Households used it for mats, sandals, baskets, even fuel when wood was scarce. But its most profound transformation came when it was turned into writing material. From this humble reed, Egyptians created the world's first true paper. The process was deceptively simple, though it required skill. Workers cut stalks of papyrus near the base, stripping away the green rind to reveal the pale, moist inner pith. This pith was sliced into thin strips, laid side by side in a row, then overlaid with a second row placed crosswise. The layers were pressed together, the plant's natural sap acting as adhesive. As the sheet dried under pressure, the strips fused into a smooth, pale surface. Once polished with stone or shell, it was ready to receive ink. Sheets could be joined end to end, rolled into scrolls, and stored in chests or jars. To hold a papyrus scroll was to hold a fragment of permanence. On these sheets, scribes recorded harvest accounts, tax rolls, legal disputes, hymns to gods, tales of adventure, and letters between families. The material was light, portable, and durable in Egypt's dry climate. Stone preserved grand proclamations, but papyrus captured the details of daily life. Without it, the endless flow of numbers, names, and instructions that kept Egypt running would have been impossible. The scribes, guardians of writing, lived in close intimacy with papyrus. Their reed pens scratched black ink across its surface, forming lines of hieratic script. In their hands, papyrus became a tool of power. To record was to control. Grain rations, tax demands, and labor assignments fixed on papyrus bound the people to the state. In the world of bureaucracy, the written word carried weight beyond speech. Once inscribed, an order became unchangeable, a memory that endured beyond the moment. Yet papyrus was not only for officials, it was also the medium of imagination. Some of the oldest stories in the world survive on papyrus. Tales of shipwrecked sailors encountering magical islands, of princes cursed at birth, of love poems exchanged between young men and women. These fragile sheets carried voices that whisper across for millennia, telling us that Egyptians laughed, feared, and longed much as we do. Still, for most Egyptians, papyrus remained distant. Farmers might never touch a scroll. Their lives were captured only when scribes visited their villages, recording harvests or disputes. Yet, even if they never wrote themselves, papyrus shaped their world. The taxes they paid, the labor they owed, the judgments they faced, all were fixed on sheets, stored in temple archives. In this way, the plant that grew silently by the river's edge ruled the lives of millions. The state guarded papyrus carefully. Production centered near the delta, where marshes produced abundant stocks. Workshops specialized in preparing sheets, and the finished rolls were distributed to temples, courts, and administrative offices. Surplus may have been traded abroad, for in later centuries, papyrus became one of Egypt's prized exports, sought by Greeks and Romans alike. To control papyrus was to control communication, and Egypt held this monopoly for centuries. Its durability in Egypt's arid climate was remarkable. Scrolls buried in tombs or stored in dry caves have survived thousands of years, their ink still legible. From them, we learn details that stone would never tell. A wife scolding her absent husband, a student struggling with grammar exercises, an official tabulating grain. These are the forgotten voices of history carried by papyrus. And yet, papyrus was fragile in another sense. Outside Egypt's desert, it decayed quickly. In damp climates, it rotted. In humid air, it disintegrated. Its survival was an accident of geography. Had Egypt been wetter, much of its written legacy would have vanished, leaving us with only stone. But because the land was dry, papyrus endured, preserving the mundane and the profound alike. To Egyptians, this duality, fragile yet enduring, must have seemed fitting. Life itself was fragile, crops dependent on the Nile's rise, survival resting on balance. Yet life was also enduring, renewed each year by the flood. Papyrus mirrored this rhythm, a reed that grew in marshes, easily crushed, yet capable of carrying eternity when transformed by human hands. In tomb art, scribes are sometimes shown unrolling papyrus scrolls before the gods, presenting accounts of the deceased's deeds. In this imagery, papyrus was not only a tool of earthly record, but a bridge to eternity. To write was to preserve the soul, to fix memory against oblivion. For kings and officials, this meant their names would endure. For ordinary Egyptians, rarely written down, it meant silence. The plant that carried eternity also carried inequality. Still, without papyrus, Egypt's voice would be muted. Stone would give us monuments, but not the texture of daily life. Through papyrus, we hear footsteps in the dust, arguments in markets, jokes between students, prayers whispered at dawn. We see not only kings, but also the people who lived beneath them. And so, as you imagine the Nile's reeds swaying in the breeze, Remember that these simple plants shaped history more profoundly than gold or granite. For it was on papyrus that Egypt wrote itself into eternity. But perhaps the most curious question is this: if papyrus carried memory so well, why were the voices of the many, the farmers, the builders, the women, so rarely preserved upon it? Asterisk, the story of papyrus deepens when we shift from its physical making to its role as a nervous system of Egypt's state. To grasp its importance, you must picture not a single scribe with a reed pen, but a network, thousands of scribes across the land, each trained to read, write, and calculate, each reliant on papyrus scrolls to capture the endless details of administration. Without papyrus, the pharaoh's voice could not stretch from the palace to distant villages. Without papyrus, orders would dissolve into air. Training in papyrus use began early. Boys destined to become scribes attended schools attached to temples or government offices. There, on discarded shards of pottery, ostraca, or broken limestone flakes, they practiced writing. Papyrus was too precious for beginners. Students copied proverbs, multiplication tables, and model letters in endless repetition. Their instructors scolded mistakes with rods, reminding them that literacy was both privilege and burden. Only after mastering steady hands and clear signs were they entrusted with real papyrus scrolls. When finally given access to papyrus, students stepped into a world of permanence. Every mark on the sheet carried weight. Black ink, made from soot and gum, formed the main text. Red ink, drawn from ochre, highlighted headings or corrections. The contrast of colors gave documents rhythm and clarity. Even the way scrolls were rolled, tied, and sealed mattered. An official decree bound in cord, sealed with clay, and marked with a pharaoh's signet was not merely words on papyrus. It was authority incarnate. The subjects written on papyrus were astonishingly broad. There were tax registers listing farmers' names and their required grain contributions. There were legal contracts, marriage agreements, wills, land, leases, all written in precise, formulaic language. There were letters, some between officials, others more personal. A father urging his son to behave in school. A soldier writing from distant Nubia. There were hymns, prayers, spells, and lists of offerings to the gods. And there were literary work, stories of adventure, wisdom texts, satires, all recorded on the same medium. Asterisk, in each case, papyrus preserved what speech alone could not. Spoken words faded, written words endured. And in a land obsessed with eternity, this endurance mattered. The pyramids preserved bodies, papyrus preserved words. Together, they made memory last. Yet papyrus also carried the monotony of bureaucracy. Imagine an office in Thebes, a room of mud brick, sunlight filtering through a small window, scribes seated cross-legged on mats, each man bent over a scroll, copying figures. So many sacks of barley from this village, so many jars of beer owed by that estate. Day after day, the same routine, the same dull records. It was boring, and yet the reach of papyrus extended beyond Egypt in later centuries. As Mediterranean cultures encountered it, papyrus became one of Egypt's most prized exports. Scrolls traveled to Greece, where poets and philosophers wrote upon them. They reached Rome, where senators recorded decrees. For centuries, the world's knowledge was stored on Egyptian reeds. Other materials existed, parchment, wax tablets, but none rivaled papyrus in lightness and utility. To control papyrus was to control writing itself. Egypt's marshes thus supplied not only its own needs, but also the intellectual life of the wider ancient world. Still, papyrus revealed divisions. Literacy was limited. Only a small percentage of Egyptian scribes, priests, officials could read and write. For most, papyrus was distant, a tool of others' power. Farmers paid taxes, recorded on scrolls they could not read. Laborers obeyed orders written in symbols they could not decipher. Women, except in rare cases, were excluded from its use. In this way, papyrus both preserved memory and enforced hierarchy. It gave voice to the state while silencing the majority, and yet, in the fragments that survive, we glimpse humanity. A love poem written on papyrus tells of a young man comparing his beloved to a lotus. A letter complains of delayed payments. A student's exercise includes doodles in the margins, perhaps born of boredom. These small details break the monotony, reminding us that papyrus carried not only laws and taxes, but also the quirks of daily life. The survival of papyrus into modern times is itself extraordinary. In the dry sands of Egypt, scrolls lay preserved. For millennia, tombs, caves, and temple archives yielded caches of documents when rediscovered by archaeologists. From them, we reconstruct not only events, but routines. How bread was rationed, how labor was assigned, how disputes were settled. Each fragile sheet adds depth to our picture of Egypt. A voice long silenced, speaking again. To hold such a fragment today is to feel the strange weight of time. A scrap of papyrus, browned and frayed, with lines of faded ink, carries the thoughts of someone who lived 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. That person is gone, their body dust, but their words remain. Papyrus gave them that endurance. And in this endurance lies the plant's quiet power. Still, the question remains, why were some voices preserved while others were lost? Why do we read the decrees of kings and the exercises of students, but not the songs of farmers in their fields? Was papyrus too precious to capture the lives of the many, or did the hierarchy of Egypt decide whose words deserved eternity? Asterisk, if we wish to complete the story of papyrus, we must move from the scrolls themselves to the larger question of memory. What was chosen to be written? What was preserved, and what was left to vanish? For papyrus was not merely a medium, it was a filter, a gate through which only certain voices passed into eternity. The majority of papyri that survive to us are not craned proclamations, but mundane documents. A work order for quarrymen, a receipt for grain, a student's clumsy exercise, copying the same line again and again until his hand grew steadier. These scraps of daily life, boring to us perhaps, were the scaffolding of Egypt's world. Tell us how rations were distributed, how lawsuits were settled, how debts were tallied. They remind us that civilization does not endure on temples alone, but on the steady hum of paperwork. And yet, amidst the monotony, flashes of humanity appear. A letter from a soldier in Nubia to his family speaks of longing and weariness. Love poem praises a girl's voice, sweeter than beer. A satirical text imagines animals taking on human roles, a donkey lecturing on law, a cat presiding over a council. Such moments remind us that Egyptians not only counted and taxed, but also dreamed, joked, and loved. Papyrus, fragile as it was, carried both the mundane and the poetic. Temples served as archives, storing papyri in bundles tied with cord. Officials deposited contracts, hymns, and tax rolls within storerooms. Over decades, these collections grew vast. And yet, papyrus was vulnerable. Fire could consume it, insects could eat it, dampness could dissolve it. Many archives vanished in time, their scrolls reduced to dust. What we recover today are mere remnants, rescued by the accident of dry sands or sealed tombs. Entire libraries' voices of generations are lost forever. This fragility shaped Egypt's own view of writing. Inscriptions on stone claimed permanence. A king's name carved in granite would last for millions of years. Papyrus, by contrast, was practical but impermanent. Perhaps this is why so much official propaganda was carved in stone, while papyrus carried the daily grind. And yet, ironically, it is the papyri that give us the truest sense of life. Stones boast. Papyrus records. The spread of papyrus beyond Egypt shows its enduring value. In the Hellenistic age, Greek scholars in Alexandria copied works of philosophy and science onto Egyptian papyrus. Roman senators wrote decrees upon it. For centuries, Egyptian marshes supplied the Mediterranean world with the very substance of literacy. When supplies were interrupted, rival centers like Pergamon turned to parchment, and slowly papyrus lost its monopoly. But for over 3,000 years, it was the backbone of written communication. One might imagine the silence of those whose voices were never written. Farmers who sowed fields, builders who dragged stones, women who spun thread most never touched papyrus. Their words faded in air, unrecorded. The plant that carried eternity chose its passengers carefully. Kings, priests, scribes, the literate, elite. And so, when we unroll a papyrus scroll today, we hear only certain voices, while the majority remain mute. History, as always, is selective, and yet, even in its selectivity, papyrus reveals more than monuments alone. From a fragment of an account, we learn how many jars of beer were needed for a work crew. From a student's exercise, we glimpse the patience of teaching. From a love poem, we see that longing is timeless. These small voices, though scattered, survive because papyrus carried them. The plant that grew silently in Nile marshes became a vessel of human feeling across centuries. Archaeologists today handle papyri with care, but their fibers brittle, their ink fading. They place them under glass, read them with magnification, deciphered the curves of hieratic script. Each line is a puzzle, each word a fragment of a life. And in these fragments, we reconstruct not only Egypt's glory, but its ordinary days. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: papyrus was once common, used everywhere, in every office, temple, and home of the literate. It was not rare or precious then, but an everyday tool. Today, its surviving scraps are treasures, locked in museums, studied with reverence. What was once boring routine has become priceless insight. And so we return to the question, what does it mean that Egypt's eternity was carried not only in stone, but in reeds? The pyramids still stand, but it is the papyrus scrolls that let us hear voices, faint and human. Without them, Egypt would be mute, its life hidden behind stone. With them, the whisper of the past endures. Still, another question lingers. Lud, if papyrus carried eternity for kings and scribes, what of the millions whose voices were never written at all? Did they trust the river, the soil, and the gods to remember them in silence? Asterisk, if the pyramids and temples are Egypt's monuments to eternity, then the tombs of the Valley of the Kings are its most intimate corridors of memory. Behind their painted walls lay not just kings, but the labor of communities who carved and decorated them in silence. These workers were not anonymous peasants, pulled at random from fields. They were skilled artisans, stonecutters, and painters, gathered in a single place, the village of Deir el-Medina. Unlike the pyramid builders who came and went seasonally, the tomb workers of the New Kingdom lived in a permanent settlement. El-Medina, whose ruins still sit on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Thebes' modern Luxor, is a walled village, built deliberately by the state to house its labor force. Rows of mud brick houses lined a narrow street, packed close together. The village was small, perhaps only 40 to 60 houses at a time. Yet, within its walls lived generations of artisans whose task was sacred: to prepare the eternal homes of the Pharaohs. Each house was modest, built of mud brick with 2 or 3 small rooms, a flat roof, and a courtyard. Inside, floors were beaten earth, walls plastered with mud. Storage jars stood in corners, mats covered sleeping areas, and hearths glowed with embers. To us, it seems cramped. But to those who lived there, it was security. The village provided wages in the form of rations, bread, beer, onions, fish, and sometimes meat. In return, the workers gave their lives to carving tunnels into the rock, chiseling hieroglyphs, and painting scenes of gods and kings. The organization was strict. The workforce was divided into two crews, left and right, each assigned to one side of the tomb. Within these crews, men held ranks: foremen, scribes, stonecutters, plasterers, painters. Their work required precision, not brute strength alone. Tomb walls demanded straight lines, proportional figures, and carefully inscribed prayers. Each mistake risked offending the god. Life in Deir el-Medina was both monotonous and extraordinary. By day, men left through the village gates, walking the path toward the Valley of the Kings. There, under the burning sun, they descended into half-finished tombs, working by torchlight in narrow corridors. The sound of chisels echoed, dust filled the air, and progress was painfully slow. A tomb could take years, even decades, to complete. Work was divided into small, repeatable tasks: cutting stone blocks, smoothing walls, sketching outlines in red ink, filling them in with black, then painting colors: red for men's skin, yellow for women's, blue and green for divine figures. By night, workers returned to their houses, where life resembled that of any village. Women ground grain on stone querns, kneading dough for bread. Children fetched water from nearby wells. Families gathered for meals of bread, lentils, and beer. In some houses, men kept astragal broken pottery shards on which they sketched practice drawings or jotted notes. These astragots survive today, preserving glimpses of humor, boredom, and daily concerns. The wages of the workers, though modest, set them apart from peasants. They were paid directly by the state, supplied from royal granaries. Their rations were more secure than harvest-dependent villagers, and sometimes included luxuries like fish or wine. Their status was higher too. As artisans serving the pharaoh's eternal destiny, they carried prestige. Tomb graffiti suggests they knew their worth. They sometimes named themselves proudly in sketches, leaving behind fragments of individuality, otherwise lost in Egyptian society. But life was not without hardship. Strikes, the earliest recorded in history, occurred in Deir el-Medina. When rations were delayed, workers refused to enter the tombs, instead gathering at temple gates to demand payment. Papyrus records from the time of Ramses III describe these protests: hungry workers, unpaid for weeks, insisting on their bread and beer. The strikes reveal not only hardship, but also the workers' confidence in their collective power. They were essential, and they knew it. Religion infused their lives. Shrines to local gods stood within the village, and workers often worshipped Hathor, Ptah, or Mereseger, the cobra goddess said to guard the Theban hills. They left small offerings, carved, stele, or painted images on limestone flakes. Devotion was personal, woven into their identity as men tasked with sacred labor. The tombs they carved were for kings, but the prayers they whispered were for their own families. Protection. The monotony of their work day after day in the darkness of tombs was balanced by the color they gave to walls through their hands. The gods took form: Osiris enthroned, Ra sailing across the sky, Anubis guarding the dead. These images, painted carefully in narrow chambers, were never meant to be seen by living eyes once the tomb was sealed. They were offerings to eternity, made in silence, destined for shadows. To labor so patiently on art that would be buried forever is perhaps the most striking feature of their world. And yet, their own lives, unlike the kings they served, were not written in stone. They lived in mud brick houses, fragile and temporary. They died in modest graves with a few jars of food and amulets. Their names, preserved only in astraca and papyri, survive by accident, not design. Still, these fragments give us a rare glimpse of ordinary people in an ancient world usually dominated by kings. The village of tomb workers reminds us that Egypt's grandeur was built not by faceless masses, but by small, tight-knit communities, men and women whose lives were repetitive, constrained, and humble, yet whose labor shaped the eternal memory of their rulers. And so, question lingers. How did it feel for a man who lived in a mud brick house to spend his life painting golden halls for a king who would never know his name? Asterisk to enter more deeply into the lives of the tomb workers at Deir el-Medina, we must linger inside the narrow streets of the village itself. Here, daily rhythms unfolded in ways both ordinary and extraordinary, reminding us that behind the chisels and pigments of the Valley of the Kings were real households, bound by routine, community, and survival. The village was compact, no more than a few dozen houses, yet every space was alive with activity. The street was a single central lane, so narrow that two donkeys might struggle to pass each other. Children ran barefoot, playing with bits of clay shaped into toy animals or small spinning tops. Women ground grain endlessly on heavy stone querns, their backs bent, their hands moving rhythmically as flour built up in shallow troughs. The sound of grinding echoed through the street. Steady background hummed to daily life. Inside the houses, space was limited but functional. The front room often served as a workshop or reception area with mats for sitting and low platforms for resting. Further back lay storage spaces, cooking areas, and steps leading to flat rooftops. Roofs were vital extensions of the home places, to dry food, store tools, or sleep on warm nights when the air inside grew stifling. Jars of water stood in corners, kept cool by evaporation. Oil lamps flickered in the evening, their light dim but steady. Food was central to the workers' world, and their wages were measured in it. Papyrus records from the village list the rations with astonishing detail. Monthly allocations of grain, supplemented by vegetables like onions and lentils, fish from the Nile, and occasional portions of meat. Beer, thick and nourishing, was brewed in great vats and distributed regularly. Spread, baked in clay ovens, came in many forms: flat rounds, conical loaves, even shapes molded with impressions of animals or gods. Meals were simple but sufficient, sustaining men whose labor underground demanded strength. Work and home were connected by strict schedules. At dawn, men left through the gates of the village, carrying tools, copper chisels, wooden mallets, baskets, and ropes. Their path led them across the rocky desert to the Valley of the Kings, where entrances to unfinished tombs yawned like wounds in the cliffs. Once inside, torches lit the darkness. Stonecutters swung mallets with dull thuds, plasterers smoothed walls. Scribes drew guidelines in red ink, and painters followed with black outlines and bursts of color. The work was repetitive, but each stroke was precise, measured, and purposeful. At midday, laborers rested, eating bread and onions, drinking beer carried in jars. Conversation filled the darkness, complaints about rations, gossip about overseers, jokes passed between friends. Then, after more hours of chiseling and painting, the crews returned to their village by evening. The cycle repeated endlessly, sometimes for decades, as tombs stretched deeper into the earth. Yet the workers were not voiceless. Astracal broken pottery shards found in abundance at Deir el-Medina record their thoughts. Some carry sketches of animals, caricatures of overseers, or crude drawings of gods. Others record notes, absent because of illness, absent to brew beer, absent to bury his mother. These brief records, routine to scribes, now breathe life into the workers, showing us not kings, but ordinary men balancing duty, illness, family in grief. Strikes reveal another side of their world. When rations failed, workers did not suffer in silence. The first recorded labor strike in history occurred here in the 12th century BCE. Hungry and unpaid, the crews laid down their tools, marched to nearby temples, and sat in protest. They demanded bread, beer, and fairness. Surviving documents describe officials scrambling to appease them, rushing to distribute rations. This episode shows that the workers understood their importance and dared to confront the state. However cautiously, religion shaped the workers' identity. Each family maintained small household shrines, often dedicated to Hathor or Ptah, the goddess Meretseger, imagined as a cobra, was believed to guard the Theban hills and punish those who sinned. Workers carved stele to her, begging forgiveness for misdeeds or thanking her for mercy. These private devotions reveal the closeness of faith to daily life. Men who spent their days carving pharaohs. Eternal tombs still turned to personal gods for their own survival. The women of Deir el-Medina carried heavy burdens, though their names are less recorded. They managed households in their husband's absence, ground grain, baked bread, brewed beer, and cared for children. Some may have sold surplus goods, trading with neighbors. Women also appear in records of legal disputes, claiming inheritance, managing property, or resolving conflicts. This suggests that within the closed world of the village, women had unusual visibility compared to those in rural farming communities. Children, too, were part of the rhythm. They learned crafts early, assisting in small ways until old enough to join crews. Boys who showed aptitude might train as scribes, apprenticing under officials. Girls learned domestic skills, but may also have worked in brewing or weaving. Their lives were overshadowed by yet monotony was their constant companion. Day after day, chiseling stone, painting figures, grinding grain, hauling water-through tasks changed little. To outsiders, their lives might seem dull, but it was in this repetition that Egypt's eternal monuments were born. Their patience, their routine, their unremarkable tasks created works that kings hoped would endure forever. And so, the story of the village raises another question. How did these men reconcile their own modest lives, lived in cramped houses, with the splendor of the golden halls they carved for pharaohs? To conclude the story of the tomb workers, we must follow them beyond their village and tomb sites, into the ways they remembered themselves or were forgotten. Deir el-Medina gives us a rare chance to hear voices that usually vanish from ancient history, because its isolation preserved both its ruins and its records. What we learn from it is not only how men carved kings' tombs, but how they lived, quarreled, prayed, and faced death. The workers' tombs, carved into nearby cliffs, speak eloquently. Unlike the grand burial chambers of pharaohs, these were modest but personal. Painted walls showed family banquets, fishing in the Nile, or worship of household gods. Scenes were colorful but simpler, filled with images of wives and children, not armies or conquests. Here, in their own tombs, the artisans portrayed the lives they valued: food, family, and divine protection. It is striking that men who painted golden halls for kings filled their own resting places with humble domestic joys. The burial goods they placed beside their bodies were modest jars of beer, bread, loaves, amulets, and Shabti figurines meant to serve them in the afterlife. But these objects, plain compared to pharaonic treasures, revealed the same hope that death was not an end, but a continuation. The belief in eternity, which they labored to secure for kings, was also their own comfort. Even the poorest worker might be buried with a clay figure or a small charm, a reminder that the gods did not forget the humble. Their records also reveal conflicts and humanity in full. Straka, found at Deir el-Medina, preserved not only sketches and jokes, but complaints and disputes. Neighbors accused one another of theft. Workmen appealed to foremen over rations. Families argued about inheritance. One ostracon records an accusation of adultery. These small quarrels remind us that even within a community devoted to eternity, human life remained messy, marked by jealousy, hunger, and love. Remarkably, the workers also left behind stories of corruption and fraud. Documents describe how some officials diverted rations, how bribes were exchanged, how favoritism stirred resentment. Even in a village built to honor kings, human weakness crept in. The tomb workers were not saints, but people, as flawed and ordinary as we are. Their paperwork, preserved in shards of pottery, strips away the grandeur of Egypt and shows its true face: people striving, failing, and surviving. Strikes, too, leave their mark. The records of Ramses III's reign describe how workers laid down their tools when food failed to arrive. "We are hungry," they declared, sitting in protest at temple gates. These strikes are extraordinary, not only because they are the first in recorded history, but because they show confidence. The workers knew their value. Without them, tombs would remain unfinished, kings would be dishonored, and the state would falter. Their protest was both survival and assertion of dignity. The presence of women in village records also gives us a rare glimpse into gender roles. Some women appear in legal disputes, managing inheritance or property. Others are mentioned in accusations of sorcery or quarrels over fidelity. In a society where women's voices are often muted, Deir el-Medina shows that within its walls, women carried agency running households, participating in trade, and sometimes shaping legal decisions. Their lives, though confined, were not invisible. Religion bound the community tightly. Shrines dotted the village, dedicated not only to great gods, but to local deities like Meretseger, the cobra goddess of the hills. Workers carved steely asking her forgiveness or praising her protection. They believed she punished oath-breakers with snakebite or illness, but also shielded those who prayed sincerely. In these small acts of devotion, we see men grappling with conscience, seeking mercy for their faults, and affirming their place in the moral order of the cosmos. What makes Deir el-Medina extraordinary is how much of it survives. Most ancient Egyptian villages have vanished, their mud brick homes melted back into desert dust. But here, isolation, preserved walls, tools, astraca, and even papyri. From them, we glimpse details that stone monuments never show. How much grain a man ate each month, how often he stayed home ill, what jokes he scribbled during work breaks. The boring details of daily life, preserved by chance, make this one of the most human sights in Egypt. Yet, we must not forget the tension in their lives. Each day, they left their modest homes to carve and paint the tombs of kings' vast halls, of gold and lapis, filled with treasures beyond imagination. By night, they returned to houses of mud brick, meals of onions and bread, and disputes over rations. The contrast must have been sharp, to build eternity for another while living in such ordinary fragility. Did they ever resent this imbalance? Did they ever pause in the flicker of lamplight to wonder why their lives were so small while the king's tombs stretched so vast? Perhaps they found solace in believing that their own eternity, though humbler, was still secured. In their painted tombs, they showed themselves fishing, feasting, and resting with family. For them, the afterlife was not a golden palace, but a continuation of daily life of ordinary joys, repeated forever. In the end, the village of Deir el-Medina is a monument as remarkable as any pyramid, not of stone, but of memory. It preserves not kings, but workers, not victories, but quarrels, not treasures, but rations. In its narrow streets and painted tombs, we glimpse Egypt as it truly was, a place where ordinary people labored, prayed, protested, and dreamed. And so, The question remains, when we marvel at the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, do we remember the kings inside the moor, the hands that carved their walls, the forgotten workers whose lives filled the village of Deir el Medina? Asterisk. If bread and beer were the daily fuel of Egypt, then taxes were the lifeblood of the Pharaoh's state. To build temples, fund armies, and sustain the great bureaucracy, the king required a steady stream of grain, livestock, and labor. Unlike today, where taxes are filed on paper or paid in coin, the Egyptian system was deeply physical. Was measured in cattle driven across fields, in jars of grain counted one by one, in bundles of flax or honey delivered to temple storehouses. Taxes were not abstract. They were lived realities, felt in the fields, barns, and homes of every village, from the earliest dynasties onward. The state organized elaborate surveys to measure its wealth. The most famous of these was the cattle count, a massive operation, repeated every 2 years during the Old Kingdom, later becoming annual in some periods. During this event, officials traveled from village to village, counting herds, measuring land, and recording harvests. The results determined not only how much grain would fill the granaries, but also how much prestige a king could claim in inscriptions on temple walls. Pharaohs boasted of vast herds, an overflowing silence proof of their divine success in maintaining Malat, the balance of the cosmos. But for the farmer, the cattle count was not a boast, but a burden. Imagine a small household, its family herding goats and cattle on the edges of the floodplain. When officials arrived, they did not come alone. They brought scribes, overseers, and guards. Scribes carried pallets and scrolls of papyrus, ready to record the numbers. Overseers inspected fields, estimating their yield. Guards ensured cooperation. For the farmer, there was little choice but to comply. His animals were tallied, his harvest measured, and a portion demanded for the state. The records of these assessments survive in fragments. A papyrus might note, so many cattle in the herd of such and such, so many sacks of barley from the field of Ani. Each entry was precise, each number binding. Taxes were calculated not in coin, but in the raw staples of survival. Grain, in particular, was the foundation of the system. It was collected, transported to silos, and then redistributed as wages, rations, and offerings. In this way, the cycle of grain fed not only bellies, but the machinery of government. Livestock, too, formed a significant part of taxation. Herds of cattle were valuable, not only as food, but as symbols of wealth. In temple reliefs, rows of oxen are shown being led to the pharaoh, their horns decorated, their bodies strong. Sheep and goats were counted as well, their wool and milk contributing to the economy. Even geese, honey, and fish could be listed as taxable goods. Nothing produced by the land escaped the eye of the tax officials. The process was monotonous but unrelenting. Scribes measured fields with ropes, stretching them along furrows to calculate acreage. They inspected irrigation, dikes, and canals, ensuring that land was fertile and productive. They questioned villagers about yields, sometimes harshly. In difficult years, when floods were poor, disputes arose. Farmers might insist their harvest was meager, while officials pressed for the same quotas as before. These tensions could lead to punishment whippings, confiscation of goods, or forced labor. Yet taxes were not only burdens. They also sustained Egypt's remarkable stability. The grain collected funded massive state projects, temple construction, pyramid building, canal digging, fed workers, priests, and soldiers. It ensured the pharaoh could maintain power across a vast land. Taxes bound villages to the state, linking the humblest farmer to the grandest temple. Through this system, Egypt became one of the most centralized economies of the ancient world. At the heart of it all was the scribe. With reed, pen, and papyrus, he transformed flocks and fields into lines of text, numbers that could be carried to the capital. In this way, the scribe's hand was as powerful as the overseer's whip. Without records, there was no tax. Without tax, there was no state. The bureaucracy, dull though it may seem, was the true engine of Egypt's longevity. But for the farmer, standing in his field, surrounded by officials, the system must have felt heavy. His cattle counted, his harvest taken, his labor demanded. He was left with just enough to feed his family. In good years, he managed. In bad years, hunger lingered. The pharaoh's granaries might be full, but the villager's jar could be empty. Such was the paradox of Egypt's greatness. Its stability rested on the endurance of its people, who bore the burden silently, year after year. And so, as we picture the cattle counts, the measuring of fields, scribes tallying grain, we are left with a question. Was this system a triumph of order, or simply a more elegant way of binding farmers to endless labor? Asterisk, the machinery of taxation in Egypt reached deep into every corner of life. To understand it more fully, we must step into the bureaucratic world that managed it, where scribes held their reed pens like instruments of power, and where the counting of cattle and fields was as sacred as any prayer to the gods. Each tax cycle began with surveys. Officials from the central government, often accompanied by priests, traveled to districts along the Nile. Their arrival must have stirred both anticipation and dread. Villagers knew what it meant. Their harvest would be measured, their herds tallied, their obligations fixed. These officials were not casual visitors. They represented the authority of the pharaoh, and their word carried the weight of law. The methods were deliberate. To measure land, surveyors used ropes of standard length, stretching them across fields to calculate area. Teams of men walked methodically, counting paces, recording boundaries, and noting irrigation ditches. These measurements were not only practical, but also symbolic. They reaffirmed the pharaoh's ownership of the land. In Egypt, all land technically belonged to the king. Farmers merely held the right to cultivate it in return for taxes. Each survey was thus a reminder of who truly controlled the soil beneath their feet. Livestock counts were equally systematic. Herds of cattle, sheep, or goats were driven before officials, each animal inspected, sometimes branded and tallied. Scribes wrote down the totals using hieratic shorthand on sheets of papyrus. These numbers were then forwarded to higher authorities, where quotas were calculated. Taxes might be exacted in the form of live animals, or, more commonly, in products derived from the milk, hides, wool, or meat. In temple reliefs, long processions of animals are shown being led toward sanctuaries, a visual echo of these routine counts. The burden of taxation fell unevenly. Wealthy estates, especially those tied to temples, often enjoyed privileges or exemptions. Temples themselves received tax revenues, feeding their priesthoods and funding their rituals. By contrast, small farmers bore the brunt. Their yields, carefully measured, were divided into portions, some for their families, some for seed, and the rest for the state. In poor years, this division was cruel. A farmer might watch officials haul away grain while his household rationed bread. Papyrus records revealed the tension. One document from the New Kingdom notes a farmer pleading that his field yielded too little to meet the required quota. The scribe, unmoved, recorded his obligation anyway. Another text describes punishments for non-payment, confiscation of goods, seizure of animals, even forced labor on state projects. Taxation was not a negotiation. It was an obligation enforced by the machinery of power, and yet the system was astonishingly efficient. The grain collected funded everything from pyramid construction to military expeditions. It paid the rations of tomb workers, sustained the priests who performed daily rituals, and filled the silos that stood as symbols of abundance. In a sense, taxes were the invisible scaffolding of Egyptian civilization. Without them, no monument, temple, or bureaucracy could have survived. The scribes who managed this flow of wealth enjoyed prestige. Literacy was rare, and those trained to read and write were valued above ordinary farmers or laborers. In tomb scenes, scribes are often shown seated calmly, writing while others toil. Their tools were simple pallets of wood with slots for black and red ink, brushes made from reeds, sheets of papyrus rolled into scrolls, but their influence was immense. A single mark of their pen could mean the difference between security and ruin for a farmer. It is no wonder that in Egyptian wisdom texts, the profession of the scribe was praised above all others. The scribe's body is sleek, his hands are soft, while the farmer's hands are calloused and his back is bent. But even scribes were bound by the system. Their own rations, homes, and futures depended on keeping the machinery of taxation running smoothly. They were agents of the pharaoh, but also servants of the bureaucracy. Their lives, too, were structured by endless repetition, copying figures, writing receipts, tallying quotas. It was dull work, but essential. The connection between taxes and religion was profound. Egyptians believed that gods required offerings of food, drink, and goods. Temples were not only places of worship, but economic centers, supported by tax revenues. Each loaf of bread placed before a god statue, each jar of beer poured in ritual, came ultimately from the labor of farmers and herders. To pay taxes was not only civic duty, but also religious obligation, sustaining the gods, who in turn sustained Egypt. And yet, beneath this religious justification, the reality was harsh. For the farmer, tax season meant anxiety. Would the flood be high enough to bring abundance? Would the officials demand more than the land could yield? Would his family have enough left to eat after quotas were taken? The cycle of taxation mirrored the cycle of the Nile, predictable, repetitive, and inescapable. The monotony of it all is striking. Year after year, officials traveled the same routes, measured the same fields, counted the same herds. Farmers, year after year, bent under the same obligations. Scribes filled papyri with endless rows of numbers. It was boring history, and yet, without this monotony, Egypt's grandeur could not have stood. And so, as we picture the cattle counts and field surveys, we are left with another unresolved question. Did the ordinary farmer see the pharaoh as a divine protector, or simply as a distant figure whose scribes carried away his hard-earned grain? Asterisk, to bring the story of Egyptian taxation to its close. We must follow the grain, the cattle, and the countless tallies beyond the moment of collection into the silos, the temples, and the machinery of the state that depended on them. For taxation was not merely about taking, it was about redistribution, order, and the invisible scaffolding that bound Egypt together for millennia. Once the grain was collected, it rarely stayed in the village where it was grown. Boats carried it north and south along the Nile, there, hulls loaded with heavy sacks. Oarsmen rowed steadily, the river bearing Egypt's wealth from field to city, from local storehouses to central granaries. At the capital, whether Memphis, Thebes, or later Pyramises, great mud brick silos stood ready. Workers hauled sacks up ramps, pouring kernels into high openings until the chambers were filled. Scribes stood by, recording each delivery. Grain was not simply food, it was a number, a measure, a line in the bureaucracy's endless accounts. From these central reserves, the state fed itself. Temples received enormous allocations, sustaining their priests, singers, and laborers. Royal projects drew rations from granaries, feeding builders, stonecutters, and artisans. Armies on campaign were provisioned from the same stores, their bread and beer prepared long before they marched. Even officials in distant provinces received their due in grain or goods sent as part of their wages. Taxes, once taken, became the bloodstream of Egypt, flowing outward again to sustain the organs of the state. But this system also reinforced inequality. Temples, favored by pharaohs, accumulated wealth on a scale that rivaled the crown itself. States, tied to royal families or high officials, sometimes enjoyed exemptions, while small farmers bore the same demands year after year. The silos might be full, but the poorest households sometimes rationed meager loaves. To see processions of cattle driven to temples while children went hungry in villages must have stirred quiet resentment. Yet the system endured its monotony, wearing down resistance. Ritual framing tax as divine order rather than oppression. The very language of taxation reflects this duality. Inscriptions describe offerings to the gods given from the pharaoh's bounty, but behind these offerings lay the labor of farmers whose grain filled the storehouses. In tomb scenes, we see scribes tallying cattle, officials measuring fields, and peasants delivering produce. These images, carved to honor the elite, inadvertently preserve the burden of the ordinary. The bureaucrats stand proud, pens in hand. The farmers bend low, carrying sacks. The contrast is silent but telling. One of the most vivid records of taxation comes from the New Kingdom, when papyri describe disputes over quotas and punishments for evasion. Some farmers tried to hide part of their harvest, burying jars of grain or driving cattle into the hills. Officials responded with inspections, surprise visits, and in some cases, whippings or confiscation of property. The system was flexible enough to survive deceit, but rigid enough to crush most resistance. Egypt's stability depended on it, and the bureaucracy guarded it zealously. And yet, despite its harshness, the system brought a kind of security. The state's ability to store and redistribute grain meant that famine was less devastating than it might have been. When floods failed, reserves were released. When armies marched, they did not strip villages bare because rations were already prepared. Taxes turned Egypt into a machine of continuity, able to endure for centuries while other kingdoms rose and fell. This resilience was purchased through monotony, the endless counting of cattle, the endless measuring of fields, the endless tallying of grain. Religion wrapped the system in legitimacy. Farmers might resent the burden, but priests taught that. The pharaoh upheld cosmic balance. King taxes was part of sustaining the gods themselves, ensuring the sun rose, the Nile flooded, and the seasons returned. Each loaf placed before a temple statue, each jar of beer poured in ritual, was a reminder that what the farmer gave to the state was also given to the divine. Resistance, then, was not only disobedience to the crown, but a violation of sacred order. Still, the workers' own writings betray weariness. Astraca from Deir el-Medina record complaints when rations were late. Farmers' voices, preserved only indirectly, speak of hardship when quotas pressed too hard. The silence of most villagers in the record suggests endurance, not consent. Their lives were too small to be written, but their labor carried the state upon their backs. When we step back, the irony is clear. Egypt is remembered for its grandeur pyramids, temples, golden tombs, but beneath all of it lay taxes. Every monument is a monument to taxation, to grain counted and cattle tallied, without the monotony of record keeping, without the dull precision of scribes. No king could have raised his eternal house today. As we look at hieroglyphs, Carved on walls, we see kings boasting of victories and offerings. Yet behind each inscription stood a farmer whose barley was taken, a herdsman whose cattle were counted, a scribe whose pen tallied another quota. The glory of Egypt rests on their forgotten patience. And so, we are left with a final thought. Taxation in Egypt was not simply an economic system, but a philosophy of endurance. It turned survival into duty, duty into ritual, and ritual into eternity. But one cannot help asking, did the farmers who paid these taxes see themselves as part of eternity, or merely as shadows feeding the brightness of others? Asterisk, when we picture Egyptian priests, we often imagine figures in long linen robes, chanting hymns in vast temples before towering statues of the gods. And yet, one of their most distinctive features was not their garments or their rituals, but their skin, smooth, hairless, carefully shaved. Every day, sometimes twice a day, priests cut away every trace of hair from their body, scalp, beard, and even body hair till they gleamed in the sun like polished stone.